Welcome back to Inside the Wolves of K Street with Luke Mullins and Brody Mullins. We're talking about our book. We need to begin by sort of rolling back the clock all the way to the founding of the country to talk about sort of how companies became so influential now. And what's interesting to me is that the country was founded on the idea of preventing the concentration of power in government or in industry. I mean, our very country was founded by people, obviously, who left concentrated government power in England. And so our government was set up in order to prevent industries or governments from attaining too much power. In fact, in the Federalist Papers, the founding fathers talked about how they saw a time where there would be lobbying, but they thought that the corporate lobby or the business lobby would be regulated essentially by workers or what became labor unions. Luke, you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, I mean, well, just generally, the founding fathers were concerned about outside forces, right? Gaining too much power in the government, right? So, they had left England, and the big outside force there that was, exerting its power on the government was religion. Right. So they, the founding fathers move here, and they want to insulate the government from potential outside forces. Right. So there's a number of different ways you can do this. One that they considered was essentially trying to block the speech of forces that people might think would be harmful. Right. But they obviously chose against that because that's just preventing people from being free and speaking freely. What they eventually adopt is the idea that we want to have different forces that are speaking and advocating their government vigorously, and the idea is that various forces that have opposing views would argue against each other, and they would sort of serve as a check against anyone. They refer to these as factions, right? And the idea was that you could have what they called minority factions, right, which were smaller factions, and they would fight against each other. But the sort of competition between the two forces would serve as a moderating force, right? They were concerned about what they referred to as a majority faction, which would be some outside force that gained enough power to have sort of an outside corruptive influence on our government. And so they built essentially, there were two different checks on that type of power that existed in our government that they at least talked about. The first was just how big and diverse the country was. Obviously, it's much more bigger and diverse now, but at that time, the idea it was that if there's some that I think they talked about paper money, right? If there's a rash of a lot of people that want to do away with paper money in Massachusetts, for example, it would be hard, given just how diverse and large the country was, for that movement to take hold in a place like Virginia, which was hundreds of miles away. It seemed impossibly large at that time. So that just the nature of the country was viewed as a check against a majority faction taking hold. The other one was the idea that we weren't that Congress essentially members of Congress were themselves going to be subject to opposing forces lobbying them themselves, right? So that every member of Congress is going to have various influences pressuring them, and that would serve to sort of dilute the power of a particular interest. And then you have a number of members of Congress, so that the power of each force would be diluted, and it would just make it impossible in the view of the founding fathers for a majority faction to take hold. Obviously, there's a number of things that have happened in the intervening, 250 years.
But that worked for a long time.
Yes, right. for many years, it essentially held. The idea that these various forces were competing against each other, and individual members of Congress had to negotiate various lobbies,
So,
so no one lobby could be a supermajority.
so most of our book is obviously about that breakdown, but for this episode, we're talking about when it worked. You said factions. The founding fathers called them factions. I sort of consider them they're interest groups. It's basically the pro-business interest group, led by the Chamber of Commerce, and the pro-worker interest group, which is really labor unions. And those sort of two sides battled back and forth. One thing we write here very early on is this central struggle of our democracy, the prerogatives of industrial capitalism versus the best interests of the ordinary men and women, played out in a back and forth fashion, with periods of corporate excess and abuse inspiring eras of consumer reform. And for our whole country, that's how things have gone. And what's fascinating is we all remember the era where Standard Oil and the railroad barons and J.P. Morgan were the big monopolies, and they were we call them trusts. They had so much power and influence over our economy and government and in society. But that era was followed by the progressive era, where we created the Federal Trade Commission and beefed up the antitrust laws. So we have the trust era of big trust, and then we literally have the antitrust era, where the American people elected reformers to Congress who enacted laws and legislation to rein in the power of those big trusts. And then we go to the Roaring '20s and the post-World War II era, where again, it leads right into the New Deal. So we have another period of excess, and then we lead to the New Deal reforms, which is a whole series of pro-consumer, pro-American safety and health and welfare regulations that helped regular Americans. And then fast forwarding to the 1970s, which sort of where our book picks up, that's where the system starts to break down, where from the 1970s to now, we've had this period where only one side, only corporations have had all this influence, and the other side, labor unions and consumer groups, have really had very little influence in Washington from that period. Luke, you want to talk about any of the other historical changes that led to perhaps why companies had so much influence starting in the 1970s? The breakdown of labor unions, or
yeah, of course, that starts later. Honestly, as I think we'll get into in our next segment, so much of this has to do with just the state of the U.S. economy, and in the '60s, from the World War II up until the mid to late 1960s, the economy was really booming. Inflation was stable, and that allows it gave a lot of people room to criticize capitalism and the excesses of capitalism, and to sort of almost take for granted the sort of growth, the steady growth with low inflation that we enjoyed, so that sort of safety, the feeling that Americans were sort of insulated from from some kind of economic downturn, gave people were sort of comfortable, pointing out all of the many flaws in the system. And that's a period where we see unions, and we really see this consumer movement in Washington kind of come into flower, and that creates a real crisis for the business community. Starting in the early 1970s, which is most of what today's episode is going to be about.
So we write, then in the 1970s, everything changed. During the 1970s, Washington entered a new era, a nearly 4-decade-long stretch in which the corporate capitalists of Wall Street, Big Pharma, and Silicon Valley exercised as much control of the political system as did their Gilded Age predecessors, with far less risk of accountability and reform. That seems like a good place to stop for a quick break, and then we'll come back with an interview with Professor Lee Drutman.
All right.
Today's episode is brought to you by Capital Bank, a leader in political banking financial solutions. Managing a corporate or trade association PAC? Eliminate unnecessary fees, protect your funds with Positive Pay and ACH Filter, and secure deposits beyond FDIC limits with ICS accounts through IntraFi. Maximize your funds. More protection. Total peace of mind. Learn more at CapitalBankMD.com. Capital Bank. Partners in your vision. Member FDIC.
Welcome back to the Wolves of K Street podcast. Today, we're delighted to have our first guest, Lee Drutman, who wrote a terrific book called The Business of America is Lobbying. It came out in 2016, a few years before our book. It was a fantastic history of corporate power and how companies came to be so influential in Washington. So we thought instead of relying on our book, we would rely on his book. Lee is a senior fellow running the program of political reform at the New America Foundation. Came out with his book, The Business of America is Lobbying, in 2016. More recently, had a book, Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop. It came out in 2020. Most importantly, Washingtonian has named you one of the most influential people in America. Is that right?
Yes, for 4 years, although I didn't get on the 2025 list. I guess I lost influence in the Trump administration.
Yeah. And then you got your own podcast.
So many of us did, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I have my own podcast. It's called Politics in Question.
All right.
Great.
So Lee, we wanted to start off by kind of situating our listeners in the early 1970s, which is the period of time where the sort of modern corporate lobbying establishment kind of starts to generate itself. So if you can talk about, the sort of political dynamics in Washington in the early 1970s and what was happening with the corporate lobbying community, and why, and also why they were in this relatively weak position, in the early 1970s.
Sure. So the 1960s was kind of an explosion of a lot of things, and one of those things was the idea of, for lack of a better word, we call social regulation. I mean, just a lot of these regulatory agencies that we now take as part of the alphabet soup of Washington, D.C., right, from the EPA to the CPSC to the a number of these agencies. I mean, there were like 40 plus of them just sprung into being in this era. This was a time in which Ralph Nader was a very influential figure, and there were a lot of groups pushing for regulation of all kinds of industries. And this caught the business community somewhat flat-footed. I mean, business had been influential in politics, but what the federal government did was certainly less active than what the federal government does today. And so there was just sort of this assumption that the government is going to be pretty pro-business. So there were business associations, there were lobbyists, but Washington, D.C. was still somewhat of a provincial town to a lot of industry, which was more focused on, New York was really the heart of industry. And all these industries saw Washington as, sort of backwater, you keep tabs on it, but it's not going to be a real threat to your business. And then all these agencies started showing up, and suddenly it felt like the whole tide of the country was turning anti-business, and these business leaders said, holy, shite, what are we doing here? We got to get into the political game. And they funded some think tanks to put in place more pro-market advocacy. And they also just started showing up and saying, "Hey, hold on, before you start regulating business like this, we got to tell our story." And that's sort of the start of modern lobbying. It's also the transformation of Washington, D.C. from what was still somewhat of a backwater town to such a important, sprawling city of lobbyists and lawyers.
Yeah. So one of the things I found so fascinating about that period was that in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the most powerful lobbyist in Washington might have been Ralph Nader.
Yeah.
A guy who was a regular American, ran a consumer group, wrote a book. And what's amazing, he took on the U.S. auto industry at the time when, manufacturing was so central to our economy, and took on General Motors. I mean, around that time, we were saying what's good for GM is good for the country. Ralph Nader takes him on auto safety regulations, and wins, which shows like how much influence regular Americans and consumer groups had, but also how little influence GM had. I mean, GM was actually one of the few companies that had people in DC, but not many, and not enough to stop Ralph Nader. It's just stunning in this era when companies have so much influence and consumers have so little influence to think about like that, something like that could happen. Yeah. Anyway, that seemed like a real turning point.
Yeah, it was a moment in which politics was much more open to a small, dedicated, organized group. Just because there were a lot fewer people paying attention to what was going on in Washington, and so you could be a young upstart with a good sense of media savvy, but it was also a moment in which there were a lot of political leaders who were looking to make their mark as a protector of the environment, or a protector of consumer safety, or a protector of workplace safety. So it was a particular political moment in which the country was becoming much more progressive, in which Nader steps into. Right? I mean, the country is very wealthy. There's a sense that we are growing, but there's also a sense that maybe we are missing the big picture on some of these important issues.
Yeah. It was also the case that the corporate lobby at that time was just incredibly weak and disorganized. Right.
Yeah. They just sort of assumed that, the policy of America was going to be mostly pro-business. So, why spend much time trying to influence it? You just send people down to Washington to sort of glad hand, like they're ambassadors, to some ally, and just, and that's that.
Yeah, and then, of course, the other point is that, consumer groups and unions were very strong at that time, and a lot of their tactics, which seem fairly routine today, just sort of grassroots mobilization and things like that, were just so much more effective than essentially the corporate lobbying community just didn't have this sort of infrastructure apparatus to pull stuff like that off. Sort of on that point, Lee, I want to ask you about the Powell memo.
Yeah.
A fascinating document that there is a bit of controversy, right, about how much, right? But I'd love to just start with
what's the controversy about?
Well, about how directly the Powell memo itself influenced the sort of corporate resurgence of lobbying power in DC. But would love to just chat with you. Lee, what was the Powell memo?
And so the Powell memo was this memo written by Lewis F. Powell, who would later, shortly after that he wrote this memo in 1973, become a Supreme Court justice. He was a corporate lawyer. He wrote this memo on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, and the TLDR of the memo is, "Hey, business, wake up, because if you don't fight in Washington for free enterprise, the government is going to become a socialist hell, and so you better start spending some money and start mobilizing." Now, there's whether or not it was a blueprint or a wake up call, I don't know, but it was clearly a bit of both, and certainly the timing is such that. You start to see a lot of business associations, Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, throw a lot of money into Washington in the early to mid 70s. Then you see a bunch of companies starting to show up with their individual lobbyists. So I think of it as a document of its time. There was sort of this moment of panic among American business leaders who, again, I think had taken the friendliness of Washington somewhat for granted and were just sort of surprised by all of these new regulatory agencies that were cutting into their autonomy. It was also a moment in which America's dominance as the world world's leading economy was starting to be challenged as Germany and Japan and other countries that had been decimated by World War II were starting to become globally competitive again. And it was a moment of stagflation, of rising costs. And so there was sort of a general sense of panic among the business community that they were just losing out.
As I recall in our research, there were emerging fights over whether the U.S. should be an economy based on capitalism, which is amazing because we're seeing that same debate right now. All of a sudden, the business leaders where I talk to say they're doing more and more education about the benefits of capitalism, which is back to exactly how things were before. Remember, there were protests at Bank of America branches across the country. So many people were going to college and didn't want to go into business.
To be clear, there were bombings at Bank of America branches, right? It wasn't just protest,
Right. I mean, there was a generation of college students and young people who were really asking some big questions about the structure of the economy.
And then among the changes.
Well, I guess my point there was that debate was happening, certainly during the 60s, during a period of, this booming economy, right? And where things do start to change, right, is with the stagflation, of the 70s, right? Where the idea that you could no longer take a growing economy for granted, right? A growing economy with low inflation,
Yeah, that's right.
And so we sort of point out the Powell memo as sort of a key pivot point, but obviously there was other things going on at that time that caused businesses for the first time to really invest in Washington. A key stat that we have, then I want to jump to a quote from your book, is we say from 1967 to 2007, the number of registered lobbyists in Washington went from about 60 to nearly 15,000.
Yeah.
Which just shows, this period that we're talking about from about 1970s to about now, the huge growth in corporate lobbying and influence. And then, Lee, can you talk about the study that you did that we included in our book on when you did a sort of a survey of talking to lobbyists to see who they were lobbying against?
Yeah. One of the big transformations of corporate lobbying was sort of an overarching thesis of my book is, and I quote one lobbyist who told me this, who had been around for a long time, we went from, leave us alone to let's work on this together, right? So for the first wave of lobbying was like, let's get government out of our business, right? We don't want regulation. We just want managerial autonomy. We don't want government to be involved. But at a certain point, there's inflection point, maybe in the 80s, early 90s, where there's a bunch of businesses who now have established lobbying operations in Washington, and they think, well, actually, as long as we're here, maybe we can get the government to do some stuff for us, so we can get tax breaks, we can get promotion of our products overseas, we can get favorable regulations vis-a-vis some of our competitors. So suddenly, we can get subsidies, all kinds of stuff that we didn't think about, right? And like the sort of prescription drug benefit of the George Bush years is a good example. It's Medicare Part D, where for a long time, pharmaceutical industry said, we don't want government involved because they're just going to muck it up and there's price controls and we don't want that. But at some point, wait, we could get government to give us more money and by creating this new benefit, and we can prevent them from having price controls and they'll totally go for it. So there's this real important shift that it starts out businesses say, we don't want government involved, to the point where, well, government is going to be involved and now we're here in Washington, so let's get government to help us, actually. So that becomes an important shift.
That's fascinating. Luke calls that the government as a profit center.
Yes.
Well, this is from, as does Lee.
That was something that one of the lobbyists that I interviewed in my book said, that we started to see government as a profit center. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Right.
So
Lee,
when I first started
let me
covering...
ask you another question here. And first of all, what's great about Lee is that there's not a ton of academic research in the world of lobbying. So, Lee's book, that's what makes it so helpful. But in terms of the growth of lobbyists in Washington, in terms of the raw number of lobbyists, one of the things that you found in your book is that lobbying becomes sticky, as I recall, Lee.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, because this is one of your central findings, right, in terms of the growth of lobbying, or one of your big findings. Can you talk a little bit about that, what that means, and yeah.
Well, it becomes sticky in the sense that once companies hire lobbyists, then they have somebody in Washington, D.C. who is telling them, hey, there's all this stuff that government's doing that you better get involved in.
Right.
And so, well, of course, we want to be involved in it because, one, now now we see all the threats that we didn't see before, so we have to defend them. But now we have lobbyists who are working for us, and they are scouring the town for potential opportunities. Say, well, you could, invest, hire us, and we can, repeal this export tax that nobody's going to care about, or some other obscure policy. And and as companies hire more lobbyists, they have more lobbyists who are out there looking for both threats and opportunities. But also, their competitors are hiring more lobbyists too.
Mm-hmm.
So they got to make sure that they have the lobbyists who are not only defending against government doing things, but defending against their competitors using government to do things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just becomes an increasingly competitive world. It's like once upon a time, there were very few kids who did test prep. Now everybody has to do test prep, all the kids, because everybody else is doing it.
Right. Yeah, totally.
So just to go back on one point, when I first started covering lobbying for the Wall Street Journal 20 years ago, or really before, maybe 25 years ago, when I really first started covering lobbying, I thought lobbying was, the Congress or an agency is creating some new rule or regulation, and companies scramble to hire lobbyists to try to block it or shape it or whittle it down. And then later in my career, I realized that it's sort of the opposite. It's exactly what you say. It's companies proactively hiring lobbyists, going to DC to create rules and regulations that they support, or block regulations that they're against, or shift a regulation so it hurts their competitor, or start an investigation to hurt their competitor,
exactly.
distract their competitor. There's so much of lobbying now is almost a game. It's a tool of business that,
it's
right or wrong,
extension
in order
of
to have a
commerce,
successful business, you've got to have a successful Washington office. Sorry, Luke, go ahead.
It's corporate strategy by other means, not non-market forces, as they say.
Yeah. Lee, another question here, Lee. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the changing role of the CEO or top executives at companies relative to politics? In the prior to the early 1970s, very few CEOs were engaged in Washington.
That's right.
And as you said before, I mean, the idea was you just want Washington to not touch you. How does that change, right, over the following decades in terms of engagement among top executives with Washington?
I mean, the CEOs become much more involved. I mean, this becomes something that many companies actually want in a CEO, is somebody who can handle politics and who understands politics, because politics is just seen as much more important to the business. So in a different era, if you were the board of directors, you wouldn't care about that for a company, right? You just want somebody who knows the business. But now, given that the business of government is important to the business of business, you just see more and more CEOs who are actively involved in
and
politics.
Go ahead.
And I mean, I think with the Trump administration, that is like there has been like a step change in the importance of CEOs. I don't think they want to be playing this role, but this is the role that they're being asked to play.
Trump has changed lobbying and influence so much in so many different ways. One, by changing how government power is held in DC, by pulling power from Congress and committees and subcommittees and chairs to the White House and even pulling power from agencies into the White House. And then also Trump doesn't like to talk to lobbyists. He wants to talk to the CEOs. That's why everyone's going down to Mar-a-Lago. It's amazing that it actually gives the CEOs a lot more influence than they used to have. All these deals you hear getting cut are not with the high-priced Washington lobbyists. It's with Trump talking directly to the CEOs.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, it's become much more just blatantly transactional. I mean, I think for a long time, I mean, yes, it was somewhat transactional, but there was still sort of this patina that the best policy argument could win, and people would actually spend a lot of time to put forward arguments that were plausibly in the public interest. And and now I just feel like it's just become so blatantly transactional.
Totally. So
that it's like a real return to the late 19th century
smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah.
So except there's no smoke. Switching the lens for a second, though, what's interesting is that I was at a conference the other day with a top CEO talking about how, as a CEO, you don't want dysfunction, right? You want certainty, and so much of the tech industry is creating new uncertainties and new disrupting technologies, and companies will come along and change the whole economy and become new leaders. What's different now is it's so much of the disruption and dysfunction is coming from Washington, so that CEOs are required to follow Washington because the rules of the game are changing every minute. You're making investment decisions for a year down the road, 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, and your trade policy is changing every week.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, though, about this. We quote you in our book saying in 2012, political scientist Lee Drutman conducted interviews with 60 lobbyists while researching his 2015 book, The Business of America's Lobbying. Not one of them cited a labor union, consumer group, or environmental organization as his or her leading opponent in a policy debate. That's stunning.
Yeah, it is. Now, I mean, it may be that they didn't want to say that they were against those groups, so there may be survey bias. But I think a lot of what's happening is that businesses are fighting other businesses, or they are just looking for these subterranean issues that are not going to stir a lot of controversy, and they can get these little benefits, these small changes. Right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on at the agencies. I mean, it used to be more going on in the quote unquote secret Congress, in which a lot of stuff got passed that wasn't controversial because it didn't really have any opponents. Right? It was just a small tweak to some regulation or some policy that would benefit some company and didn't have any obvious enemies. And then it's just that these, the labor unions are just much weaker than they used to be. And to the extent that they are lobbying on issues, it's big, economy-wide issues that maybe the Chamber of Commerce would be involved in. And, and the consumer groups are incredibly weak and probably are also, to the extent that they are involved, they're lobbying at a very high level. And so there's just a lot of, in the weeds details of how tax policy works, how trade policy works, how various regulatory policies work, that businesses are involved in. And I mean, to make this more precise, that the Dodd-Frank bill had all of these provisions creating all of these agencies. At a high level, there were consumer groups that were lobbying for something like the Volcker Rule, which was going to sort of try to deal with the way in which businesses, were combining their investment and their retail arms, although not quite a full separation has been in the past. But I mean, it was a sort of broad principle, and then by the time the thing actually gets published by the Fed, it's goes from 10 pages to 1,000 pages, and it's just a Swiss cheese of legalese that all of the big banks spent all this time lobbying on to make sure that all of their important profit-making activities could basically be exempt. So it's the level of detail that these companies can work on because they have these armies of lobbyists and lawyers is just leagues and leagues and leagues beyond what the classic countervailing groups might have been able to do.
Right.
Yeah, and so much of this, I think, has to do with the decline of labor unions, as we've mentioned.
Yeah.
Anecdotally, I remember early in my career covering lobbying, I'd write about, labor unions against companies and companies against labor unions and all these fights. And the last bill I remember covering was card check, which I think was 2010 or maybe 2012.
Yeah, I think
which
it was
was
2010.
2010. Okay. Good memory. So labor unions trying to pass a bill to make it easier for people to vote to join labor unions. That bill failed, as I recalled. And I don't know if I ever would say that again.
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
Yeah. On a last second vote. And ever since then, every issue I've written about is hedge funds against insurance companies, or AT&T against Google, or tobacco company against tobacco company. You just don't see labor unions as a player at all.
Yeah, they're really struggled. I mean, the share of organized labor in the private sector is down to like 6 or 7% now.
Yeah.
From
Lee, can I just back you up? Let me just back you up for 1 second. You mentioned the term countervailing force here. Can you describe for our listeners kind of, the theory behind that?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is actually a term that goes back to John Kenneth Galbraith, who had this idea that was, sort of in vogue in the 50s, at a time when pluralist political theory was common. This idea that there are a lot of interest groups in society and they balance each other out, because if one group is threatened, then it will come to Washington to say, "Hey, don't tread on us." And this is the great genius of American democracy, is that it's such an open and pluralistic system that nobody can dominate. And business is checked by labor and checked by government and checked by consumer groups, and this all kind of balances out in a sort of happy Madisonian system. And that depends on there being countervailing forces that are going to represent all different sides of the argument. But as time has marched on, business keeps growing and growing, and everybody else is like flat or declining. Right. So it's not a fair fight.
Well, that was going to be my question for you, Lee, is are there any credible, or what would you view as the most credible countervailing force to corporate power today?
I mean, I guess journalism almost.
Okay.
I feel like,
so not very
even
credible.
even that is shrinking. I mean, there is a growing, activist wing of the Democratic Party as well.
Okay.
That I think is really trying to challenge corporate power.
Lefty populism.
Yeah. Do you think the increasing progressivism on the left and the populism on the right could be a growing countervailing force?
Yeah, I think that's
early.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's possible. That as these levels of economic inequality rise, as more and more people feel like they are struggling to make ends meet and just feel this gross sense of unfairness, that begins to build into a mass movement.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes a very powerful and potent force in politics, as it has throughout history, when the many have very little and the few have a lot.
Luke, any final questions or thoughts?
No, just both of Lee's books are great, or at least the most recent two. You probably have other books as well. But again, what's so helpful about Lee is there's just not a ton of real academic research. And again, Lee talked to 70, more than 50 lobbyists, right? And that's it's super helpful in terms of trying to understand the growth development.
All right, Lee, thanks so much for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Inside the Wolves of K Street. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me inside the Wolves' den here.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Appreciate it.